Hello?
Mr. Bennett?
Yes?
This is Bob Woodward of the Washington Post. I'm sorry to bother you at home. I was wondering if we could confirm some information on one of your employees, Mr. Howard Hunt.
Oh, what kind of information?
It's just profile information, mostly. We know, for example, that he works for Mellon & Company, or did work for Mellon & Company, as a writer. He's also a novelist. We know that he works in the office of Mr. Charles Colson at the White House.
And the CIA.
And the CIA.
Well, if you're conducting that kind of an investigation, certainly it comes as no surprise to you that Howard was with the CIA.
No surprise at all. Hunt worked for the CIA till 1970, from 49 to 70. Now, this is on deep background, but the FBI thinks he's involved with the break-in. And what else you got? According to White House personnel, Hunt definitely worked there as a consultant for Colson. That's Charles Colson, the President's special counsel. Did you call the White House press office? I went over there. I talked to them. They said Hunt hadn't worked there for 3 months. Then a PR guy said this weird thing to me. He said, I'm convinced that neither Mr. Colson or anyone else at the White House had any knowledge of or participation in this deplorable incident at the Democratic National Committee. Isn't that what you expect them to say? Absolutely. So, I never asked about Watergate. I simply asked what were Hunt's duties at the White House. They volunteered he was innocent when nobody asked if he was guilty.
I welcome this kind of examination.
We came,
and for the international order that we have worked for generations to build.
A new world order. New world order.
we saw.
If suddenly there was a threat to this world from some other species, from another planet, outside in the universe.
Always talk to you like they're the best. And then we're going to Washington, D.C. to take back the White House!
He died. He died.
But that's a wicked woman.
Because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
You can keep it. Period. They are the focus of evil in the modern world. It's a catastrophe.
Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome.
This is the Midnight Rider News Podcast. Hello, America and the world. Welcome to the Midnight Rider News Show. I'm St. Patrick, your friendly neighborhood host, traipsing through the trials and travails that have so tempestuously and untruthfully been blasted into your eyes, ears, and minds by the state-sponsored talking heads, court historians, and textbook conglomerates that control information today. Tonight we have episode 029, E. Howard Hunt, Watergate, and the JFK Assassination. Our guest tonight, I'm proud to say, is St. John Hunt, the eldest son of E. Howard Hunt and Dorothy Hunt, and he'll join us next in the Midnight Hour. Now, our Facebook page is at Midnight Rider News Show. That's at Midnight Rider News Show, so please like us there. Our Twitter is MWN_ST Patrick, MWN_ST Patrick. We are LinkedIn at ST Patrick. Our email remains midnightridernews@gmail.com. That's midnightridernews@gmail.com. The free archives for the Midnight Rider News Show are at midnightridernews.com. And again, writer is spelled W-R-I-T-E-R, as in someone who writes. That's midnightridernews.com. But you can also find them at iTunes, Stitcher Radio, and your favorite podcast providers. So please check out our archives. You will not be sorry that you did. So we'll be right back with St. John Hunt. Dr. John Newman joined us for two exciting episodes, episodes 017 and 023, in which he discussed JFK, Vietnam, Cuba, and Lee Harvey Oswald.
Hi, this is Dr. John Newman, author of JFK in Vietnam, Oswald and the CIA, Where Angels Tread Lightly, and Countdown to Darkness. For more on these books, Vietnam and Cuba, download episode 17 of the Midnight Rider News Show today.
Imagine, if you will, that you one day find out that your parents have been leading a cover life, a life of which you knew nothing. Then imagine that your father's real occupation had put him in the middle of both the JFK assassination and Watergate. And then imagine that Watergate took your mother's life. And what if trying to finally tell the truth tore apart the only family that you had? This story is very real for St. John Hunt, the eldest son of CIA spies E. Howard Hunt and Dorothy Hunt. I met St. John Hunt at the JFK conference in Dallas last November, a conference he'll be speaking at again this year. He was very genuine, very kind, and very interesting. His presentation enthralled the audience and had many in tears. So tonight I bring you St. John Hunt. St. John, how are you doing this evening?
Hi, St. Patrick. I'm doing pretty good. I'm glad to be on your show and ready to go.
Great, so are we. Now, I saw you speak at the JFK conference last year. Now, you'll be back at this conference again this year, correct?
Yeah, that's true. Matter of fact, I'm leaving on the 16th, and I'll be giving a short sort of lecture like I did last year, and I think I'm involved in some musical projects which are forming as we speak.
Now, you have such an interesting, unique story to tell. Now, your father, E. Howard Hunt, had a long career in the CIA. Now, as they say, once in the CIA, always in the CIA. So, please describe his entry into the CIA and what he did, at least through the Lyndon Baines Johnson years.
Well, he got into the CIA on the ground floor. When World War II was over, he worked for a brief period of time as a script writer in Hollywood, and of course he had already written a few novels, one which won him the Guggenheim Fellowship Award, and he spent that vacationing in Mexico and writing more novels. But he was looking about for something to do. He's a man of action, at least that's what he considered himself to be, and he heard from contacts that there was an outfit being formed, and he actually was invited to join, and that was the OSS. Although at the time it wasn't called Office of Strategic Services, it had another name. I'm not exactly sure. It was part of an operation out of the Defense Department, I believe. But so that was the very, very beginning of the OSS, which later kind of segued into the CIA once Harry Truman wrote the mandate for it. So he was one of the original ones. He worked his way all the way up to chief of Western Hemisphere for a while.
Now, he moves up the agency pretty quickly, and he becomes quite important during the Eisenhower years.
Yes, of course. That was, I think you might be referring to the Bay of Pigs. That was an Eisenhower operation, although by the time it was enacted, it lay on Kennedy's doorstep. But the run-up to the Bay of Pigs, all the planning and stuff, for example, in 1959, he was sent to Cuba to assess the buzz in the air. Where was there going to be a lot of support from the indigenous peoples, from the Cubans themselves for an overthrow of Castro, or was there not? And he came back and filed a report with his CIA superiors, stating that he felt that any invasion would have to be preceded by the assassination of Fidel Castro, his brother Raul, and basically half a dozen top members of the fledgling Castro regime in order for an invasion to be successful. And he was the first CIA officer to actually put that down on paper. And of course, they tried to follow through with that. He was, put in charge of a lot of CIA assassination projects, with some with the mafia members, Sam Giancana of Chicago, John Rosselli out of Las Vegas, Santos Trafficante out of Tampa, Florida, and some with Cuban exiles using various code names: Amlash, Amworld, Amwhip. These were code names for Cuban exiles who were part of an assassination team working individually to kill Castro. This went on for many, many years. In fact, it was basically a super secret operation, because they had told the president, Kennedy, and Johnson as well, that all the assassination attempts were done, they were finished, it wasn't gonna happen anymore. The use of Cuban exiles, for example, from Alpha 66, which was a anti-Castro exile group, famous for running small invasions of Cuba, burning up sugarcane fields, destroying radio communications towers, that sort of thing, poisoning wells, just to keep harassing Castro. They said that was all over with, but this went on, unbeknownst to the president, for many, many years. In fact, in 1965, 66, my father was still deeply involved in assassination plots against Castro.
Now, your mother, Dorothy Hunt, was absolutely not a typical CIA wife, unknowledgeable and always at home. What was her background in intelligence, and how did they meet?
Well, she was a Midwestern gal, and she blossomed rather quickly after college. She joined the Treasury Department, the State Department. Her first posting was in Bern, Switzerland, between 1944 and I would say 1946. And then she shifted over to the Treasury Department in Shanghai, China. She opened up the first office of economic cooperation over there. She worked under that heading, but these were false fronts for OSS. So she started out in the intelligence covert operations field to begin with. The Treasury Department and that kind of thing were just covers, as I was to find out later. She worked under, when she was in Bern, she worked under Alan Dulles, who was the station chief in Bern, Switzerland. Of course, Alan Dulles later became head honcho there at the CIA. And I'm sure he remembered my mother because she was probably one of the most beautiful women anyone would ever hope to lay their eyes on. She was just gorgeous. She enjoyed intelligence work. She was tracking hidden funds and assets that the Nazis had hidden and of course had stolen and robbed, and as they plundered country after country. Some of it coming from concentration camps, like the gold teeth. Thousands of pounds of gold teeth were melted down, and she was involved in tracking that down throughout Europe. And she enjoyed that work. And she met my father when she accepted a position with the Economic Cooperation Administration in Paris. And at the time, my father was in Paris. A speechwriter for Averell Harriman, and he worked in Harriman's office. And my mother had opportunity to go in and throughout Harriman's office on her business. They met, and he asked her out. The rest of the story is dangerous.
Yes, it sure is. Now, I've heard some people speculate that they might have even been paired up by the CIA. Do you think that's true?
No, I don't think so, because the agency regarded my mother as somewhat of a. Well, that's where I get part of the title for my book, Dorothy, an Amoral and Dangerous Woman. In a secret CIA memo, they characterized my mother as a dangerous and amoral woman, and they kind of putting pressure on my dad to reassess his relationship with this Dorothy Gautier, because at the time she had married a French aristocrat who lived in India, near Calcutta. He was a drunk, and she ended up leaving him, and then she and my father were just, I guess, hitting it off really well. So they planned to get married. It says here, Dorothy. Our pair of sources, this is a CIA memo, our pair of sources later reported that subject's wife was formerly his mistress and was openly flouted as such for several months. She was then described as an amoral and dangerous individual who underhandedly attacked those persons who incurred her enmity. So they had her sized up in that manner, and I think that probably intrigued my father even more. He's like, "Whoa, an amoral and dangerous woman! This is my kind of gal." So they got married.
Now, to say you traveled a lot as a kid would be an understatement. How many countries do you think you lived in by the time you were 18?
Well, born in the States, but within 6 months we moved to Japan, where my father was stationed up near the Atsugi Air Base up there. And so Japan for about 3 years, I learned very basic rudimentary Japanese as a 3-year-old can speak. And then we moved directly to Montevideo, Uruguay, where my father took over as station chief there. After that was 4 years, and then from there it was Mexico City, and then I think we spent a little time in the States, and then back out again to Mexico, and then to the States, and then up to Madrid in '65. We also spent some time in Argentina, in South America there. So the culture I was raised in is predominantly South American. And that's fine with me. I've always felt it's such odds with American culture. I'd never played a game of football. I mean, for me, football was soccer, and I just stood out like a sore thumb. I mean, crew cuts. I had my hair long, as is customary in South American countries. You know, boys have longer hair, little bangs, kind of like a beetle cut. So, and I had to learn to overcome. I had a bad stutter. I stuttered so badly that I couldn't even say my name for many years. I could barely speak. That was very traumatic for me. Born with a club foot, I had double vision. I was a gangly kind of 90-pound weakling. You know, just everything that my father detested. That was what I was, and I knew it and felt that. So that's the way it goes.
Well, it's not every day that a son finds out that both parents had been spies for the CIA. So, at what age did you find out, and how did they tell you?
I was 16. I was 16 years old. I guess they thought that was the age, the time to tell the kids or the kid what's really going on. And it was a very brief conversation because I had no knowledge of whether the FBI was this or the CIA was that, or and so my mother and father sat me down and said, well, we want to tell you that your father isn't working for the State Department, and that your mother is not just a cocktail embassy socialite, but we work for the CIA, which stands for Central Intelligence Agency, and it's kind of like a foreign FBI, kind of like a law enforcement on an international scale. And that was good enough for me. I mean, I didn't have anything to compare it to. Of course, years later, a lot comes out.
So I guess I'm imagining being like 16 years old and finding out that your father and mother had been spies, and you go to all your pals and say, you won't believe what I just found out. But you couldn't really do that, could you?
Well, I didn't have any pals, for one thing, because we moved around so often, and I rarely spoke the same language of the host country we lived in, that there was never any friendships formed until 68 when I went to boarding school. So at 16, when I was 16, I really didn't have anybody to tell, and I didn't know that it was such a cool thing. Anyways, it seemed like a mundane job that we moved around a lot, which was a pain in the ass.
Oh, I can absolutely understand that. Now, the Republicans take back the White House in 1968 as Richard Nixon defeats the incumbent Vice President Hubert Humphrey. While LBJ had not been hostile towards the CIA by any means, this was, to be sure, a new administration. So what were your father's ties to the Nixon White House before the break-in at the Watergate?
Well, I don't know that he had many ties to the White House. When he was stationed down in Montevideo, he had met Richard Nixon, who was vice president under Eisenhower, and they had lunch together. And Nixon remembered my father in the years to come. My father complimented Nixon on his handling of the Alger Hiss case, and Nixon was very charmed by it. And so they sat down and shared conversation in some sort of a restaurant or dining room for about an hour, a little more than an hour, he said. And of course, Nixon, I believe, kept track, sort of, on the back burner of Howard Hunt's rise through the ranks. Probably knew that he was one of the main conspirators in the overthrow of the Guatemalan regime. That was a very successful CIA operation, and that morphed into, they used the same crew, my father and others, and the potential overthrow of Cuba just a couple of years later. And I think they were really going for this kind of like, well, that was successful in Guatemala on a shoestring, basically. I mean, my father was in charge of propaganda and psychological warfare, and he was running these tapes of sounds of bombers and planes, flying through the air and dropping bombs, and the sounds of crowds screeching and hollering to be played out on the airwaves of Guatemala, with everybody thinking that this was actually something real that was going on. And it was just his little sort of, let's say, a staged play, and it worked. They got what they wanted, I guess. So they tried that in Cuba and didn't go over so well. That was probably one of the heartbreaks of my father's life. I think even more so than the loss of his wife Dorothy, my mother. I think the Bay of Pigs thing just ate away at him, because he lost a lot of his dear friends and people that counted on him. He was their guy to the White House, and when it failed, it was like a sledgehammer of steel, just crushing, just crushing him. And he never really got over that.
To improve upon the record.
And what did you understand him to mean when he said to improve upon the record?
To fabricate cables that could substitute for the missing chronological cables.
Did you in fact fabricate cables for the purpose of indicating the relationship of the Kennedy administration and the assassination at the end?
I did.
And did you show these fabricated cables to Mr. Colson?
I did.
What was his response to the fabricated cables?
He indicated to me that he would be probably getting in touch with a member of the media, of the press, to whom he would show the cables.
Were you in fact put in touch with a member of the media?
I was.
And who was that?
Mr. William Lambert of Life magazine.
Did Mr. Lambert use the information?
Not to my knowledge.
No. Now, are you aware from your conversations with Mr. Colson and the use of these cables, any strategy that Mr. Colson had with regard to Catholic voters?
Yes, sir.
Could you describe that more fully?
I believe it was desired by Mr. Colson, or at least some of his colleagues, to demonstrate that a Catholic United States administration had in fact conspired in the assassination of a Catholic chief of state.
So let's move to June 17th, 1972. There's a break-in at Democratic National Committee headquarters inside the Watergate office complex in Washington, D.C. We will all know it as Watergate. 4 Cuban Americans, 1 American. They're all arrested. They would be called the Watergate Five. What specifically was your father's role, and how did he get involved?
Well, it's interesting because the DNC, the Democratic National Committee headquarters, had offices in the Watergate complex. Watergate was a complex of office buildings and condominiums, and it had several different buildings, but it was a big layout there in D.C. and he was brought into what was called initially the Special Investigations Unit. Now this came about because Nixon, who was he was an information freak. He wanted to have information on all his adversaries, and he wanted to know what everybody was doing, and he had reason to suspect that there was people in the White House and in the FBI that were leaking sensitive material to the New York Times. When he petitioned FBI Director Hoover and CIA Director Helms to help him form a team that could look into these things kind of on the low, they balked. They did not help Nixon, and he was infuriated by this. I mean, he was the president, but for reasons of that I'm not exactly sure of. They didn't want any involvement in any kind of off-the-shelf unit that was going to go around investigating who knows what. And so, out of that frustration, he said to himself, "Well, I'm just going to form my own." And so, the first person he wanted to call was Howard Hunt, and they got some people. Gordon Liddy came from Treasury. He had been FBI also. James McCord was a CIA and also FBI prior. And they put together their little special investigations unit, which became known as the Plumbers, because one of their first tasks was to find the leaks that were directing the secret Defense Department. There was a study done on the history of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. And this was a massive undertaking, and it was leaked by Daniel Ellsberg to the New York Times. And someone leaked it to Ellsberg, and this was very embarrassing to Nixon. It was actually Henry Kissinger who was mostly angered by this. He said, Nixon said, "Well, this is the Vietnam War. This has nothing to do with me. The origins of the Vietnam War, that's past presidents." But Kissinger convinced Nixon that to let these leaks just go unpunished would look very, very bad for him, even if the subject matter didn't pertain specifically to Nixon. So he bought into that, and so they formed this the Plumbers to plug the leaks of the Pentagon Papers, and that morphed into well, how are we going to handle this? And they drew up a plan to go down to Los Angeles and break into the Daniel Ellsberg psychiatrist office to find anything they could to embarrass and defame Daniel Ellsberg. There had been rumors that Ellsberg had a strange relationship with one of his kids, or he had a mistress, or he was homosexual, or something like this. And Nixon said, "Oh, this is a good thing. We're going to get Ellsberg. We're going to embarrass him in the press, and that'll put the end to all this leaking of the Pentagon Papers." And that was one of their first ops, and there were many, many more. There was discussions about assassinating, like Jack Anderson, who was a famous columnist in Washington D.C. That he had his sources in the CIA, and he was coming up with some pretty interesting stuff in his columns, all about the Bay of Pigs and strange goings-ons at the White House. So he had his connections, his deep sources, and the Plumbers talked openly and to their superiors about potentially assassinating Jack Anderson. It never happened, obviously, but that's how crazy these guys were for action, and the whole plan was Gemstone Plan, which was a multi-layered, many-faceted plan, which included fire bombings and included hiring Cuban exiles to disrupt and beat up people who were attending the Democratic National Convention in Miami. There was a houseboat down there that was going to be rented and stocked full of high-class hookers behind two-way mirrors. There was going to be cameras, and the hookers were going to bring Democrats notoriety up and give them LSD, and then they were going to be filmed. And there was a plane, a chase plane, that they were going to chase the Democratic people that were flying and see if they could pick up any communications. It just went on and on and on. And my father was just loving it. He was in the thick of things, and he felt he was totally protected, which didn't turn out to be a very valid assessment.
Now, it is at this point that I will admit a long fascination with the personalities inside the Nixon administration and the Watergate scandal more specifically. Now, I'd like to ask about your father, E. Howard Hunt, and his personal relationships with the members of the administration. About whom was he fond? Who was trusted? And whom did he respect?
He liked Charles Colson very much because, number one, Colson was a Brown alumni, and my father was a Brown alumni. And Colson was instrumental in bringing my father into the White House. As a matter of fact, it's probably not widely known, but the retirement of my father in 1970 from CIA was just a cover mission. And he had retired twice before, once in 1965 when he went to Spain, and that was to handle meeting AMLASH and coordinating with Manuel Artime various assassination attempts against Castro using a diving suit that had been soaked with poison pens, poison cigars, and all this kind of stuff. That was 65 and 66, so he didn't actually retire. It was a cover. And here in 1970, he was doing the same thing because throughout his tenure at the White House there, he was reporting back his activities for the plumbers and for Nixon and their chiefs of staff to Richard Helms, the CIA director, on a personal level. You know, his notes and memos went directly to Helms and no one else. So the CIA knew exactly what was up with the White House and all the different things that they were involved in, all of which were probably illegal.
Oh, probably so. Now, was there anyone with whom he had contention, either within the administration or within the Watergate project specifically?
He liked Gordon Liddy very much, but he thought Gordon Liddy was a bit of a grandstander. He didn't feel good about James McCord. There was something off about McCord that Papa was just couldn't completely figure out, and he had feelings like, well, McCord seems to be okay, but there's something underneath this that I'm not getting, you know. And it turns out McCord had his own agenda. But as far as the inner circle of the White House, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Mitchell, he liked John Mitchell. He thought he was fine. He didn't really care for Haldeman or Ehrlichman. He felt these guys were strutting their stuff too much. He felt that they showed a sort of a crass level of power. They didn't grow up or work hard at what they were. They were part of Nixon's re-election team, and he gave them these great inner circle jobs. So he kind of he kind of resented people that sort of had things handed to them on a platter, you know. But he didn't really talk about other people in the White House, you know. Like Eagle Crow was his boss, and he was an insider in Nixon's White House. But he pretty much was tight-lipped throughout his whole life.
Let's listen to some of that interaction. This is a phone call between Chuck Colson and E. Howard Hunt.
Well, the reason I called you was to get back to the beginning here, is because the commitments that were made to all of us at the onset have not been kept. And there's a great deal of unease and concern on the part of 7 defendants, and possibly, well, I'm quite sure me least of all. But there's a great deal of financial expense here that has not been covered, and what we've been getting has been coming in very minor dribs and drabs. And Parkinson, who's been the go-between with my attorneys, doesn't seem to be very effective, and we're now reaching a point at which...
Okay, you've told me all don't tell me anymore. I understand it. Let me just...
Because these people have really got to dig. This is a long-haul thing, and the stakes are very, very high. And I thought that you would want to know that this thing must not break apart for foolish reasons.
I agree. Yeah. Oh, no. Christ, no. Everybody gets...
And while we get, third, fourth-hand reassurances, still the ready is not available.
Mm-hmm. I follow.
That's the basic problem.
I follow you. Okay, well, you told me all I need to know.
All right.
And the less I know really of what happened, the more help I can be to you.
All right. Now, we've set a deadline now for close of business on the 25th of November for the resolution, the liquidation of everything that's outstanding. And this is, I'm now talking about promises from July and August.
That was E. Howard Hunt and Charles Colson, the special counsel to the president. Now, it seemed like they had an open and candid relationship, even at times when Chuck Colson didn't necessarily want that to be the case.
Yes, yeah, they did. He felt that they were, and Colson felt that they were friends, in addition to being workmates, you could say. But of course, when the shit hit the fan, so to speak, and my father was calling Colson, reminding him of the responsibilities that the White House had to my father, you know, he could tell that Colson was very cagey, non-committal. Of course, it was on the phone, so you know. And I think at that moment he realized that these people were not gonna stand up for him. That he was on his own basically, and that's when the real heat started happening. When the blackmailing started happening and the threats against the White House and this and that, it got bad.
Yes, and we're going to go into that in just a few minutes, but let's stay with the night of the break-in. What exactly happened, and what specifically was his role?
My father assembled a team to break into the office of the Democratic National Committee at the Watergate, and there was actually 3 break-ins, 2 successful ones prior to the June 17th break-in, at which time the 5-man break-in team were caught red-handed by D.C. police. My father was stationed sort of catty-corner in a hotel with monitoring equipment. He had some people that were monitoring the recordings. They had the phones bugged at the DNC, and it was Officer Larry O'Brien, who was, I think he was at the time the head Democrat, you know, whatever it's called. But the phone buggings, one phone tap was not functioning properly, and so they got the authorization from John Mitchell, the Attorney General, through Eagle Crow, my father's superior in the White House, to go ahead and gain a 3rd entry. And it just seemed very risky for the amount of potential material that could arise from a successful tap on this particular phone. And there's a lot of things going on here. You had James McCord, who was seemed to have his own agenda. He was disappearing on upper floors, sometimes for 40-45 minutes. He taped the door locks open so they wouldn't click closed and lock when the door was shut. The tapes had been discovered by a security guard and taken off, and then McCord just put them back on, which aroused even more suspicion from the security guard, causing him to call the D.C. police. But the other members of the team, Virgilio Gonzalez and, let's see, who else was there? Frank Sturgis. Frank was all about, he liked Frank. Frank and my father were good pals. He said of Frank, Frank is the kind of guy that I could just say, to point at someone and say, Frank, shoot that son of a bitch, and Frank would go shoot him. Period. No questions asked. And Bernard Barker was one of the team members. Now Bernie Barker is a great guy. His nickname was Macho, and he came from Castro's secret police. From Batista's secret police back in Cuba, and so he was actually a very mild-looking, short, squat, sort of fuddy-duddy looking guy, but he was a killer, you know. And he was my father's right-hand man for many, many years prior to the Bay of Pigs and throughout the Bay of Pigs and all this. And then there was another member of the team. Did Diego something or other, and two of the team members, the Cuban team members, were still contract agents to the CIA, And then my dad was reporting to the CIA. McCord was reporting to who knows who. And it was a multi-layered, like an onion operation. I mean, everybody seemed to have their own secret little agendas. So, one or two of the members were looking for a specific phone book, which was supposed to be in the top drawer of somebody's desk in the DNC. And this book was apparently a ledger detailing a prostitution ring, a call girl ring in Washington, D.C., which would embarrass many people, Republicans and Democrats alike, and Nixon wanted to get his hands on that. They were also searching for a dossier that Fidel Castro had compiled, listing some 80 or 100 assassination attempts against him, showing photos of the arrested failed assassins, the weapons and the poisons that they had, and this was very interesting to Nixon. Nixon wanted a copy of that dossier, and they had heard their intelligence sources told them that there would be a copy in one of the safes in the offices of the DNC. So there was a lot of things going on, and it's still somewhat of a mystery as to what exactly did anybody hope to gain by having these guys break in a third time. I mean,
Right, you're exactly right, and it makes me wonder if your father had some hesitancy or concern about going in a third time, or if he still felt very confident in the mission.
Well, I think they felt confident because of the first two successful entries. He felt confident that a third entry could be done. But too many things started going wrong. When the pieces of tape that McCord had fastened over the latches of the doors leading from the garage up to the next floor, and then that door is taped open to the next floor, and that door is taped open. When those were found to be missing and removed, my father wanted to shut down that operation right then and there. He said, "No, this is it. We're done. We're out of here." And they should have listened to him, but Gordon Liddy, who actually was superior to my father for that particular operation, denied my father that, and he said, "No, we're going to go ahead."
Now, it has been speculated that McCord might have purposely misapplied the tape on the exterior door. Do you believe that theory has any validity?
Well, as I said, he had funny feelings about McCord. He didn't trust him totally. My mother definitely didn't trust him or like him. She told my father, that man is going to get us all in trouble. He's shifty, and you just can't get a beat on what he stands for. You can't really pin him down to things. He's just sort of ambivalent about this and that. And she didn't like that. She didn't like James McCord at all. And there's been speculation that McCord, botched it on purpose, but I don't buy that because the way it happened was so sort of routine. I mean, the security guard is making his rounds. He sees these doors with little pieces of tape sticking out on one side, and he's like, "Oh, well." First he thought, "Well, this is from the cleaning crew. This is what they do sometimes so they don't have to keep getting keys and blah blah blah," and so he removed them all, and then the second time, that's when he called the DC cops. But there's been a lot of speculation about the DC cops. They were aware that the DNC was broken into that night. They had gotten a heads up from their sources. In other words, at the time there was very few people that didn't know about the break-in the night before and the night that it happened. It seems that many different factions in and around D.C., political and intelligence, FBI, CIA, D.C. Metro Police, they all knew something was going to go down. And in that way, you can consider it a setup. If everybody else knew, geez, how come nobody thought to warn the entry team? Didn't someone think to say, "Hey guys, my sources say that everybody in town knows about this job, and it's still a matter of speculation.
So as the break-in is occurring, your father and G. Gordon Liddy are across the street in a Howard Johnson's, observing the entire thing.
Yes, and when they saw out the window the lights go on and the team members with their hands in the air, they had the team had walkie-talkies, and the police came in, and when my father and Liddy fled the room at the Howard Johnson's, they left like $30,000 in cash there. One of the minor but turning out to be a huge piece for the D.C. police was that Bernard Macho Barker, had on his person his little telephone book, which under the alphabet letter W was WH House, White House, and then it was my father's private number at the White House. He also carried a check my father had given him to deposit in a bank, and so that it was very soon that they linked E. Howard Hunt to members of the break-in team, and Jack Anderson certainly knew Frank Sturgis very well, and knew of my father very well, and putting two and two together, just was easy.
I can't even imagine what the situation must have been like at home shortly thereafter. It had to be chaos, right?
No, actually, the family, except for myself, were in Europe, and so I was the only one at home. My sister Lisa, the eldest, she was at her boyfriend's house for that week, and so I was sleeping in my bedroom downstairs, which one of the great memories I have of my father was that he hand built my room in the basement corner so I could have my own room, and he did this all by hand, and he showed me the use of tools and measurements and how to do this and that. It was one of our great kind of more normalized moments, father and son type things. But all hell broke loose when my father came home in the wee hours, downstairs to my black because I had no windows and it was pitch black in there. He turned on the light, bright as hell, kind of barges into my room, turns on the light, and orders me to wake up and go upstairs, get dressed and go upstairs and meet him in his bedroom and don't ask any questions. And that was very chaotic. I'd never seen my father so bedeviled, so frantic, nervous, stressed out, at a loss for words. I mean, and I knew at that moment only that this could potentially be my moment to shine for my father. After all the disappointments that I was to my dad, I thought almost immediately that wow, maybe he's asking for help, and I'm going to do exactly what he wants. I'll do anything, and I just wanted to be totally in his corner, and I did everything that he wanted. And I went upstairs, and he's changing his shirt and loosening his tie and so washing his face and patting the sweat off his head and making phone calls and waiting for phone calls and kind of just giving me orders. He threw 2 suitcases on the bed and said, "Say, go into the kitchen and get some cleaning stuff, some towels and some cleaner and come here." And and then when I got back in the bedroom, he was still on the phone, but he was giving me orders. Open the suitcases, and you need to take everything out, clean the inside of the suitcase from top to bottom, and then clean everything that was in the suitcase, each piece individually, and then put it all back in the suitcase, and then wipe the outside down. And I did. There was, I had no idea what these things were. There were a lot of cords. There was antenna-looking things and walkie-talkies and transistor-type looking stuff, metal boxes and plastic boxes, and lots of cords and that kind of stuff. And And so I did. I cleaned everything up and put it all back in. And then he said, "We're going to we're going on a ride, and just you're good. Please don't ask me any questions. I've got too much on my mind right now." So I just sat quietly in the car as we put the suitcases in the back seat, and we drove out 40 minutes or so to the old canal locks, and we each took a suitcase and walked to the edge and flung them in the water and drove back.
So when your mother returns from Europe, and knowing that she had done years in intel herself, was her reaction more pragmatic, okay, we need to stay calm and let's make a plan, or was she angry, like, I told you not to get involved with those people in that White House?
It was a combination of both, because in the months prior to Watergate, as a matter of fact, in the month prior to my father taking on his job at the White House, and when he, quote, let's say he retired in 1970, but that wasn't really a full retirement, as I said. But he promised my mother, she made him promise that they would live a much more normal life, that he wasn't going to seek out any jobs or any type of employment with any covert agencies or intelligence services. That was all behind him. He was going to write books, and she was going to be the domestic lady that she wanted. They were going to ride horses through the valleys and hills of Potomac, Maryland, and be close to their children, and be really hands-on parents, which they never were able to do. And he promised, and then he got this thing with the White House, and he talked to Dorothy about it, and she said, absolutely not. These, they want you to start an intelligence unit for the White House, and what is it they want you to do? And she just, they argued and argued and argued, and his vanity and his ego got the best of him, and he joined up because, it was the White House. The big time. And so when she came back, I mean, she heard about Watergate in London in the press, and he had called her, and they had spoken on the phone a couple of times, and she asked if she should come home right away, and he said, no, just finish out the vacation with the kids and just come home as naturally as possible. And I had been running money for my father up until that time, but when my mother came back, she took over duties as the paymaster or the money gatherer, as such. And what's the tragedy about that is that she had planned to divorce my father upon her return from Europe. That was all set in her mind. She was sick of it. She was sick of that he broke his promise. She was sick of his infidelities. She was tired of his self-inflatedness, and she was done. Period. Over. And she really, that was her husband, and she came to bat for him. She gave her life really for him.
Yes, she absolutely did. And for everyone out there, how did this Watergate scandal lead to the end of your mother's life? Well,
when she came back, she became instantly and deeply and actively involved in the Watergate affair, as they called her a paymaster, and she would talk on the phone to persons in the White House or connected to the White House, and get instructions as to where to pick up a certain package or a key that would unlock a locker that then would have a package in it, or perhaps another key to another locker which would have a package in it of money. And these were, they asked my parents for a roundabout figure how much it would cost, living expenses and everything, for our family, for Gordon Liddy's family, for McCord's family, and the 4 Cubans. And so they came up with a sum of money, which the White House was aghast. I mean, this was hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars. But, we didn't know how long this whole Watergate problem was going to go on. I mean, my father assumed from the moment that his team was arrested that it would be nothing more than a matter of a simple phone call or two from the right people with the right connections, and his team would be set free, and nothing would ever be said about it beyond that. And he just couldn't understand why nobody was taking care of the persons that were in D.C. jail, and so the money was coming through in bits, $75,000 here, $50,000 there, and my mother. I went with her once or twice, waiting by the phone, a phone booth in Little Village, Potomac, Maryland, way late at night. Very creepy. My mother had her little pearl handled 25 caliber automatic with her in her lap, and wait for that phone to ring, and it would be just so dead quiet, and we just sit there barely breathing, and it was just dark, and no one was around, and it was just like, I'm thinking, what's going to happen? I mean, somebody could come up alongside the car and blow someone's brains away. I was scared, and my mother was a real brave and a strong person. And then the phone would ring, and it sounded like it was so loud, bang, and we just jump, a foot in the car off the seats. And she'd get out and answer the phone, and and then she'd drove me home, and then she'd be off to pick up the money and bring it back to the house. And I waited for the sound of her car to come back up the gravel driveway. As sleep was overtaking me, I kept shaking myself awake. I just wanted to hear her come back. I just wanted to know she was safe. And so then the money stopped flowing. And when it did flow, it was much less than what they said it was going to be for that particular payment. And then the threats, my father and mother both started threatening people in the White House. My father called Charles Colson and said in no uncertain terms that he possessed knowledge of the operations in Watergate and all the other ones he did that could put the Attorney General John Mitchell in prison and probably everybody else in Nixon's circle. And if the responsibilities of the White House vis-a-vis the money weren't met, then they would have to consider that my father was no longer going to cooperate and keep silent. And of course, when Nixon heard about this, he was just aghast, because on the White House tapes and Nixon's Oval Office tapes, there's tapes you can hear Nixon just ranting about Hunt. Got to keep Hunt quiet. Got to keep Hunt happy. Hunt, whatever it takes. And John Dean goes, well, we were thinking maybe $1 million or more. And Nixon's like, $1 million? I can get that. I know where to get it. And, John Dean and Ehrlichman and Haldeman, they had no idea why Nixon was so scared and so insistent on keeping hush money payments to Howard Hunt. Well, my father had documents and memos dating back to 1959, 1960, the formation of an assassination squad known as Operation 40, which then Vice President Nixon helped arrange, green-lighted, and served as liaison between this secret Operations 40 group and the White House. Nixon knew that my dad had him by the balls, basically, that if this were to come out, that Nixon approved of and helped orchestrate in terms of the overall overseeing the formation of Operation 40, if this were to come out before the election, there would be no chance that he would be elected. It would be the end of Nixon once and for all politically. And so Nixon was very fearful of the information that my father and my mother had. And one of the things my mother had to do was fly to Chicago and pay off this guy, Stevens. I think it was a small, very custom-made bugging service. This guy handmade the best kind of surveillance equipment, bugging and such. And they owed him about $8,000, and so my mother flew. But there was another reason why she went to Chicago. She had arranged with a CBS anchorwoman, the first black anchorwoman for CBS, actually in the country, named Michelle Clark, that upon landing in Chicago, they were going to hold a press conference, maybe within a day or so or two or whatever, where my mother was going to blow the lid off the White House. She at that point had absolutely had it, just up to beyond, any more tolerance for any of this, any of this crap that, that was squeezing our family so intensely, and these trips at midnight to these basement parking lots or Greyhound bus stations in the dark of the night and just in bad areas of town and all of this. And she knew she was being followed. She could tell. She was, she still had skills from her years in covert ops for OSS and then as a contract agent for CIA. She worked at all these different embassies, photographing documents that the CIA wanted, which otherwise they wouldn't have had access to. So that was her little part in it. But she was absolutely the end of the line. She didn't care what happened. Let the chips fall where they may. And so this press conference was going to be held within a day or two of their landing in Chicago. And I'm sure that many other people knew about this threat. My mother was carrying documents and canceled checks linking the committee to re-elect the president with the laundered funds through a Mexican bank made payable to Bernard Barker, one of the Watergate defendants. This was dirty money. This was money coming from George Bush Sr., for one. Nixon referred to them as the Texas people, and other folks who had contributed to this huge slush fund of cash that Nixon had available to him. And they knew that you couldn't let that plane land, and the plane did land, but it crash landed, burning and killing almost everybody on board. I think there was like 12 survivors killed, the pilots and stewardesses, and my mother, of course, probably burned. I mean, she burned to death. I hope she had, I hope she was unconscious at the time, but I don't know that she was. And that was it. And the conspiracy to bring down that plane is evidenced by the fact that, one thing, the FBI was there within 45 minutes. They had about 30-some agents on the ground in 45 minutes, and that's unheard of. That is absolutely unheard of. Those agents would have had to have gathered at a central point for the express purpose of going to the crash site because they were so close. And in documents by the I think it was the Ruckelshaus house. He was NTSB, I believe, and he wrote to FBI, acting FBI head in Chicago, what were all these FBI agents doing on the ground? As far as he knew, FBI does not have jurisdiction over domestic air crashes, and he wanted to know what was going on. And the response from the FBI chief in Chicago was that, in fact, FBI did have authorization when a crash, when they had information indicating that the crash was a result of murder, manslaughter, or sabotage. So that was the end of my mother's life.
Were you immediately suspicious of a conspiracy in your mother's death, or was there a point where you became suspicious?
No, I was not immediately suspicious of anything. I just thought the plane just crashed. I mean, I had heard that, I knew that the plane was headed for O'Hare Airport, but was diverted at the last minute to the older, less technical, secure airport Midway. It didn't have the newfangled, self-guiding landing things that O'Hare had. And so I just thought, well, it was snowing, and the plane just came down. But I think about less than a year later, an article came out in Rolling Stone magazine called the Watergate Watergate murders or something like that, or the something in Rolling Stone. And my sister and I read it, and we just were shocked. I mean, here they were saying, it was an article written by Sherman Skolnick, who was a Chicago investigator, and he had a good track record of bringing down corrupt judges and corrupt government officials in and around Chicago, and he investigated the crash, and he came up with his theory on the crash was that it was sabotage, clear sabotage. He listed the reasons and evidence, and when we read that article, we were so angry, we wrote Rolling Stone magazine, never thinking that they'd even actually read it, let alone answer it, saying, how dare you print this kind of, shitty journalism, this wild speculation of whoever this Skolnick person is, how dare you, don't you think we've had enough heartache, and don't you think we've been bleeding enough, now you have to talk about that my mother was murdered and blah, blah, blah. Well, they read it, and they sent out a new reporter in their crew named Julia Cameron, who later married Martin Scorsese. She spent 2 weeks with Lisa and I at our home in Potomac while we packed up our lives. It was a very depressing and heart-wrenching time, and Julia was just magnificent, and she stayed with us for 2 weeks and reported her thoughts and the whole thing in an article that came out in another issue of Rolling Stone called Life Without Father.
Do you have an idea or even a speculative guess as to who might be responsible for your mother's death?
No, I don't.
What I was really wondering was how far up the political ladder you think that goes, if it goes into the White House, and how far up the chain in the White House.
I remember Charles Colson, in an interview with Time magazine, said that, he said, quote, "I don't say this to many people, but I think the CIA killed Dorothy Hunt." And I found that remark. And years later, when my father passed away, I got a hold of Mr. Colson before he passed away. And I had to track him down through his ministries thing, But, and I asked him, in 74, you were quoted in Time magazine saying the CIA killed my mother. Is there, can you tell me anything about why you feel that? And he said, he goes, that's what I feel, that's what I know, and I am not going to say anything more about it for my protection and for your protection. Just I can't talk about that. It's much too serious. So I can't imagine Richard Nixon himself authorizing the bringing down of the United Airlines flight, killing everybody aboard. And people go, well, killed all these innocent people. Well, that's a classic CIA method of assassinating one person, is to bring down a whole apartment complex just to get one guy, or burn up an entire movie theater just to get one person in there, bring down a plane just to get one person. But later, the people were speculating that more than my mother and Michelle Clark on that plane had something to do with deep politics in Washington, D.C. at the time. And they talk about actually 12 people on that flight that were somehow linked to Watergate and to scandalous things engaged in by John Mitchell and so forth. But the very next day, that flight crashed December 8th, and the next day, December 9th, Nixon appoints Eagle Crow, who was my father's boss in the Plumbers, and one of Nixon's, strongest supporters and defenders, to the position of Undersecretary of Transportation, just the very next day. Now, that gave him control over the Department of Transportation oversees the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board, which is the sole investigating unit for airline crashes. So Krogh was now in a position, and Nixon, through Krogh, was in a position not only to guide the investigation, but to include or exclude pertinent information about the crash. And just 3 months later, Nixon appointed another Nixon loyalist, Alexander Butterfield, to become administrator of the FAA. Dwight Chapin, a bagman for Creep, left the White House at the same time and became joined United Airlines as director of marketing planning. I mean, it's like Nixon was all over this crash and all over the investigation. And
now, as I'm sure you've heard before, there's a phone conversation which takes place shortly after your mother's death, and it's between the President Richard Nixon and Charles Colson.
Right.
Now, we're going to listen to it right here.
I just got a terribly tragic bit of news. That plane crash, Howard Hunt's wife was on it. And it's, his wife is dead? Yes, sir. She was killed in that plane crash in Chicago. Oh, my God. And it's a tragedy. I don't know whether the man can survive it, with all he's gone through. She was an extraordinary woman, just extraordinary. I think any judge who has any compassion will call that trial off. Any judge will. You mean call her off permanently? Not permanently. Well, maybe separate him out or delay the trial or something, because she was a terror of strength to him. I mean, she was a rare, gifted woman, multilingualist, brilliant, a lot of charm. But it's sure that they have children, 4 children, beautiful children. It's a tragedy. Devout Catholics, and that's God. Probably saves him from committing suicide. Because are you a Catholic? Yes, sir. Yeah. But that's life, I guess. Just kind of a shocker. The numbers that I don't know what impact that'll have on the case. I think it'll delay. I'm sure it'll delay it. I just can see that I'm taking that to trial next week.
Now, it's an odd call in that Nixon seems like he doesn't know, Colson seems absolutely stunned, and for some reason Richard Nixon seems overly concerned that your father's a Catholic. What do you think about that call?
Right. They're each covering their own asses, because Nixon knew these were being recorded, and when Colson tells him that Howard Hunt's wife was killed in a plane crash, to me, Nixon is very calm and very blasé. Was she a Catholic? I think he says, or something, what about the children, or something? I mean, to me, it's potentially Colson's way of letting Nixon know that the plane had crashed. You don't have to worry anymore. You know what I'm saying?
Oh, absolutely.
And all Nixon is just like, poor man. And then he immediately starts, developing this scheme. Well, we can use that. We can, make people feel sorry for him, and maybe that'll be clemency and all this kind of stuff. He's always scheming, But
before we move into the JFK assassination, do you remember your father's opinion of John Dean?
My father's opinion of John Dean, at best, was that Dean was a brown-nosing, sucking up to Nixon, goody two-shoes, kind of a worthless, fishy type of scumbag. He just didn't like Dean at all, but this was an underestimation of what Dean really had going on, because it was John Dean who led the cover-up of the Watergate, the whole Watergate cover-up, and Nixon did not know in advance that the DNC was going to be broken into. Dean knew, and so Dean is playing this very, very kind of dangerous fence riding. He's leaning a little to the left on the fence, and he's leaning a little to the right. he wanted to come out looking like he's just such an honest person that he just had to tell the president that there's a cancer on the presidency. There's things going on which you have to be made aware of. Well, these were things that Dean had planned and planted and oversaw and knew everything about. Dean was up to his eyeballs in this, and he just wiggled his way out. And the testimony that he gave at the Watergate hearings was such an abomination. I mean, he rehearsed his answers with the prosecution, changing actually the statements he had given initially under oath to fit what the prosecution needed him to say. And to this day, Dean is looked upon like some sort of savior of democracy, like he's a hero, and he's actually this worst scumbag of all of them, because but then again, my father underestimated Dean. He thought he was sort of an ineffectual, limp-wristed sort of goody two-shoes boy. But Dean was was much more than that.
Well, rumors have existed for years that Dean's motives in the break-in were neither political nor ethical. What are the chances that Dean was protecting information about his wife, Maureen?
Right, that goes to the black book of the D.C. call girl ring that his wife, Maureen, used to be belong to. I mean, she used to be a call girl for this ring in D.C. before she met John Dean, of course, and so he was well aware of this, and so there was that aspect of it too. This call girl ring that could name a lot of people and could name Maureen Dean as being, one of the high-priced gals.
Yes, I can definitely see why Dean would have wanted that potential leak to be plugged. But shortly after the break-in, a somewhat mysterious character known in Watergate lore as Deep Throat began leaking information to the Washington Post. Now, did your father believe all along that it was Mark Felt, the FBI's associate director, the man who Bob Woodward would later reveal as the man behind the leaks, or did he believe it was someone else, or even maybe a composite character?
Well, Nixon himself knew that Mark Felt from the FBI. I think he was the second or third man down from the top. Was leaking information about White House information to the newspapers. That's on tape. Nixon knows. Mark Felt, talks about Mark Felt. But my father never believed that Mark Felt was the one and only Deep Throat. My father felt now. My father told me that, in his opinion, after years of thinking about it on and off, he felt that Alexandra Haig was Deep Throat much more so than Mark Felt could have been. And Deep Throat may have, in fact, been a combination of several sources, Alexandra Haig and Mark Felt, and who knows who else. They kind of all rolled into one and became Deep Throat. But my father always felt sure that Alexander Haig was Deep Throat.
This lifestyle of high-level spycraft, this is a life that ended with your father imprisoned and your mother taken from you permanently. Now, I can imagine that some animosity for your father existed in you at this time. Am I wrong about that?
Yeah, you are. At this point, I didn't have any animosity against my dad. I didn't feel. I didn't put blame on him because I didn't know the backstory of a lot of it. The promises that he had made to my mother about not getting involved and stuff. And I mean, I heard them arguing because my basement room my father built was directly below their master bedroom, and I couldn't hear what they were talking about, but I could hear their elevated voices muffled through the floor. And they never argued ever in their whole lives. I never saw them argue once, and all of a sudden it was happening like nightly, eveningly, twice a day, and so, but I didn't know that this was connected in any way. I didn't, and I still don't blame my father, and I never have blamed my father. I know who my father was, and I know what possessed him to be a part of the White House intelligence covert operations team. And I know he had a huge ego. He was a very selfish, self-centered person that basically hated everybody. He hated Jews. He hated blacks. He hated Polish people. He had an epitaph for every race and creed. If you weren't white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, you were hated. He was a very he's a very multi-layered man, very complicated person, and I never blamed him. My sisters blamed him, and until his dying day, they held him responsible. But I knew that it was my mother's choice to come back and help him. She could have come back and not helped him, stayed out of it, let things go wherever they were going to go, but that just really wasn't like her, She was Dorothy, and she was going to struggle through this. And I think she knew the end was coming, because this was obviously a no-win situation. You can't blackmail the President of the United States and expect to live. You are going to be killed, and in some bizarre fashion, and she knew it. And I think it saddened her greatly and deeply, because she knew she wasn't going to be with her children, but it also gave her a sort of a sense of upcoming relief. From she had broken her back twice, once skiing and once on a horseback accident, and she was in considerable pain. She was addicted to muscle relaxants and Valiums and codeine, and my father, of course, had been an amphetamine freak his whole life, so they were, pill popping for decades and decades, and I think everything just didn't look very good for my mom, and I think she just knew that one of these nights she wasn't coming back, and she just went ahead with it. She was like, fuck him,
She sounds like an amazingly strong woman, and it's an awful tragedy, but I really do admire her attitude and her spirit. So we're now going to move to what has been called E. Howard Hunt's last confession. But before we discuss that, I want the audience to hear the tape. This is super spy E. Howard Hunt giving his taped confession of his role in the JFK assassination.
I heard from Frank that LBJ had designated Cord Meyer Jr. to undertake a larger organization while keeping it totally secret. Cord Meyer himself was a rather favored member of the Eastern aristocracy. He was a graduate of Yale University and had joined the Marine Corps during the war and lost an eye in the Pacific fighting. I think that LBJ settled on Meyer as an opportunist, Perrin like himself, Perrin, and a man who had very little left to him in life ever since JFK had taken Cord's wife as one of his mistresses. I would suggest that Cord Meyer welcomed the approach from LBJ, who was, after all, only the vice president at that time, and of course could not number Cord Meyer among JFK's admirers. Quite the contrary. As for Dave Phillips, I knew him pretty well at one time. He worked for me during the Guatemala project. He had made himself useful to the agency in Santiago, Chile, where he was an American businessman. In any case, his actions, whatever they were, came to the attention of the Santiago station chief, and when his resume became known to people in the Western Hemisphere Division, he was brought in to work on Guatemalan operations. Sturridge and Morales and people of that ilk stayed in apartment houses during preparations for the big event. Their addresses were very subject to change, so that where a fellow like Morales had been one day, you're not necessarily associated with that same address the following day. In short, it was a very mobile experience. Let me point out at this point that if I had wanted to fictionalize what went on in Miami and elsewhere during the run-up for the big event, I would have done so. But I don't want any unreality to tinge this particular story, or the information, I should say. I was a bench warmer on it, and I had a reputation for honesty. I think it's essential to refocus on what this information that I've been providing you, and you alone, by the way, consists of. What is important in the story is that we've backtracked the chain of command up through Cordmeyer and laying the doings at the doorstep of LBJ. He, in my opinion, had an almost maniacal urge to become president. He regarded JFK as he was, in fact, an obstacle to achieving that. He could have waited for JFK to finish out his term and then undoubtedly a second term. So that would have put the LBJ at the head of a long list of people who were waiting for some change in the executive branch.
That was E. Howard Hunt in what may be the most amazing confession I've ever heard. How did that tape come about, and what was your reaction when you first heard it?
I had been, okay, well, we have to go back to, let's see, probably 2002, I think. Yeah, around 2002. My father, after being hospitalized for many months, my dad was still really sick and weak and in need of a leg amputation. His prognosis was poor, and he was resisting the idea of being without one of his legs. He was suffering from vascular degeneration in his left leg, and he'd had several operations, but nothing was seeming going to save his gangrenous limb. And so one of the things when I flew down to talk to him was to give him life, give him purpose. And I begged him, to take the operation. I said, your family, we've lost our mother. Your family, us kids, we need you. We just need you. You can't, you've been in a lot of tough situations, and this is just another tough situation, Papa. You please, you have to go through with this amputation and get better. And he did. And I began to get the idea that that my father was somewhat of a broken and beaten man. In other words, over the years, I knew about him being involved in a lawsuit against certain persons that had provided a memo saying that from the CIA saying that one day we've got to explain what Howard Hunt was doing in Dallas on the 22nd and things like this. And then, of course, Mark Lane, a very famous civil rights attorney and one of the first researchers and investigators into the JFK assassination, amongst others, had written a book suggesting that the CIA was behind the JFK assassination, and in no uncertain terms mentioning my father as being potentially involved. And there was another book that had come out around the same time, Coup d'etat in America, by by Canfield, and Weberman. And this said my father was one of these three tramps that were arrested at the scene of the assassination in the boxcars behind the grassy knoll moments after the shots were fired, and one of them looked like E. Howard Hunt. Of course, this was because my father's his picture, many pictures of him, were all over the front pages for a couple of years because of the Watergate trials and his involvement with in Watergate. So someone had noticed that he looked an awful like one of these three tramp hobos that had been arrested, and so Canfield and Weberman wrote this book, and they did a marvelous, a clear overlay of my father's face on the top of the tramp's face, the old tramp's face, and it looked pretty convincing to me. I was at that point wondering, well, sure looks like him, could that be him? So I knew people were making money off of accusing my father of these various crimes, such as being involved in Kennedy's assassination. I didn't know yet one way or another if he was or if he wasn't. I just thought that at this point in his life, he was probably one of the last people alive that could, shed some light on this. And I really got him. I really worked on him, for about a week. I kept kind of digging into him, saying, aren't you sick of these people, these liberals writing these books about you and saying whatever they want to and making money, a lot of money? I mean, Papa, look, you've given your life to this country, and these guys are walking all over you. Aren't you angry? Don't you want to do something about it? And I got a fire going inside of him. I really did. And so we hatched out for my next visit that he would start talking about some things, because we also discussed the fact that he was probably going to be dead soon, and that he agreed that there was some things that he wanted to disclose to me, and I said, well, we should turn this into some kind of money-making venture for you, Papa. I mean, you should make money like everybody else is making money off these Kennedy books and all this stuff. And I hadn't even read a Kennedy book at that point, and my father never read any of them. But anyway, so long story short, I got him fired up, and it was a secret between he and I. And on my visits down to Miami, he started talking about the things he did, OSS and CIA and the whole Kennedy thing, because this was going to be the selling point of a book that he was going to write with my help and the help of a very good friend of mine named Eric Hamburg. Eric came down with us, and we interviewed my dad for several days. When I flew back, on one occasion when I flew back to California, after I'd been back for about, a week, I guess, I hadn't been in touch with my father for that week, and I received a package in the mail, a little manila envelope, and I could see it was my dad's, who addressed it, and it was to me, so I took it in our apartment in Eureka, California, and it was a cassette tape, single cassette, like a Radio Shack cassette tape, and I put it in my player in the living room, and there comes his voice, loud and clear, kind of, gruffly. I heard from Frank. Wow, Papa. There was no note with it. It didn't say what was on the tape. It just said FYI, eyes only. For me and nothing. And then on the tape, he talks about, and this, I'm giving you this information and you alone. He says very clearly, and he goes ahead and starts naming names and talking about the meetings he had been privy to at a couple different safe houses in the Miami area, where a conspiracy was being formed to assassinate. On the second meeting at the safe house, he learned that it was Kennedy. The first meeting, he wasn't told specifically it was Kennedy, just that it was a very important business person and they were kind of leading my dad into it. Sturgis and Veciana and David Morales was there, and I'm not sure who else was there. But they said they had the approval all the way up, and they didn't mean all the way up to, of course, Kennedy, but they said the man next in line, and that was what was on the tape, and it just floored me. I mean, I just really didn't know what to do with it. I just kept it kind of under wraps, and when I flew back to Miami at the next opportunity, we developed a code for the persons that he knew specifically to be involved in this this one group that was actively looking to liquidate Kennedy. And he said also to me at a different time that there was more than one group. He said that there were several teams out and about and several locations where it could happen. And at that point, my stepmother and the two kids she had with my dad had already been very, very suspicious, because we had been promoting the idea of the true autobiography of E. Howard Hunt, no stone left unturned, the truth about everything. And of course, my father's attorney, Bill Snyder, who was chosen to handle my father, was just saying, Howard, you cannot say what you're intending to say. You'll go to prison. They don't care if you're 88 years old. They don't care. There's no statute of limitations on having involvement or foreknowledge of the assassination of a president. Some DA somewhere is going to pick it up and it's going to just take you to court. And just think of what this is going to cause for your family. Look what Watergate did to your first family. It killed your wife. It destroyed the 4 children. Send them all separate ways. Never to speak about it. And that really hit home. And that was a valid point. I'm not sure his motives. I'm sure he didn't care about the children, but that's how he got to my dad. And also the potentiality of being arrested. News, E. Howard Hunt's name all over the papers again, and the scrutiny and all of this stuff. And after days of back and forth, arguing with the attorney, me arguing with the attorney on behalf of my father, with my father, and my father just sitting there in his wheelchair looking like this crumpled little old man, it took the fight out of him. And he grabbed my arm and whispered to me, he said, "Son, I just can't go through with this. I can't do it." Austin and Hollis, those were his 2 kids with his second wife, Laura. They'll be around to take up the huge barrage of accusations and assumptions and allegations and incriminations that this is going to cause. And I just can't do it. He said other things to me like, when they killed your mother, and he'd never spoken about my mother's death. We had never talked about it. But in his bedroom in Miami, he had a hospital bed moved to his master bedroom. He gripped my hand so firmly, just trembling, and he whispered to my ear. He said, "When they killed your mother, my only thoughts were I couldn't protect you children," because he was in prison, of course. And his greatest fear at that point, he knew that if he didn't keep his mouth closed and plead guilty, that the children were the next on the list. And that's what he basically told me. And the hair stood up on my arms and the back of my neck, and I'm like, he was just, revealing something so serious to me that, I just didn't realize the depth of the danger that we were in as children. There would have been no qualms about picking off the kids one at a time, to keep Hunt from talking. So I got this tape in the mail, and that was the tape that I that it came out coast to coast very soon after that. None of the majors media would pick up on it. Rolling Stone ran the article about Hunt and his deathbed confession. It was called The Last Testament of E. Howard Hunt. And it was written by a guy named Eric Hedegaard, who I went to boarding school with in 1968 and 69. Yeah, so that was kind of, I must have sent them 30 or 40 emails saying who I am and what I had. And it finally got to Eric. I said, I know one of your writers. His name is Eric Hedegaard. I'm a friend of his from boarding school. It finally got to him. He called me up. He came out. Spent about 4 days. I played him tape. And I think my father wanted me to bring it out in whatever way I felt was appropriate after he died, and not to involve his family, meaning Laura and the 2 kids from her. And of course, when I was talking to Laura and the kids about that, and Lisa and Kevin got wind of it, my 2 sisters from Dorothy, they said, if any of this comes to light, you are disowned from this family for all eternity, and none of us will ever speak to you, get in touch with you, or even care about you, whether you're alive or you're dead. And I had to weigh that, as a matter of, what's important here? Certainly my family's important. I love them. I love my brothers and sisters. I loved Laura. She was a wonderful person. And Austin and Hollis, they were great kids, great kids for that family. And I did what my father wished, which was to bring it out.
You released the tape publicly on a wide scale on an episode of Coast to Coast AM with Ian Punnett. Now, it's been out for 10 years. Has there been any healing within the family?
No. I've tried many times over the years to contact my brothers and sisters, and even Laura, who lives in Florida here somewhere. And they will have nothing to do with me.
Well, that's actually sad, and I hope that changes for you. But I will say this, I've been to presentations and I've been to conferences where you've spoken, and people seem to like you, and people seem to like what you have to say, and even those who question the tape or the motives behind the tape still like your presentation and still like you personally. Have you been surprised by the open arms with which you've been met?
Yes, it's funny because at the time when I released the tape, I wasn't even thinking about how the tape would be viewed or accepted or not by the vast majority of JFK researchers and authors, guys that had spent, their literally practically their entire lives searching through files at the National Archives or online or wherever. I mean, these guys are the real heroes of all of this stuff. And it never even occurred to me, about these people. I never knew anything about them. But I was wonderfully surprised at the unanimous feeling of support and camaraderie that all of these researchers, famous guys, have written book upon books of just the best type of information. Guys, I didn't even know who they were. Who's Jim Marrs? I don't know who Jim Marrs is. Who's Ed Tatro? I don't know. Well, Ed Tatro spent the last 50 years researching this stuff. That's all he does. Bernard Fensterwald. Mark Lane himself. I spoke the very first time in 2012 in San Francisco at a small screening of Oliver Stone's film. And then they had a couple of guest speakers, and I was invited to come down, and I was so nervous. I spent days writing, like 19 pages of notes. And when I walked up on the stage at this theater, I just put the notes away. I'm like, I can't sit up here and read these notes or make any sense of it, So I just talked to the audience like people, like friends, and that it really appealed to them. And and then I was invited to the first JFK conference in Dallas a couple of years ago, and everybody was just dying to meet me and to talk about my dad and to say what a brave thing I had done, and and share notes with me, and I just didn't have enough time for everyone that was excited about me being there, and I felt very loved in a way by all these people, and it was a wonderful, wonderful feeling that still carries on.
Well, I can tell you that's a large field. I can tell you that it's a massive field, and it's a field with a lot of inner squabbles, as I talked to Joseph Green about a couple weeks ago. And I can honestly say that I've never heard anyone say that they don't like you personally. So I think that counts for something, because that's rare.
Well, I've seen some of these blogs, like let's see, there's a Spartacus is a blog site, and initially there was some people going on there, saying, well, he's a self-admitted, meth freak, and his sister claims that he browbeat his father into these ridiculous confessions and all this stuff. I mean, there was some nasty stuff said by some people. But the reason that I admitted in the Rolling Stone article that came out in 2007, my dad passed away in January 2007, and I think the Rolling Stone article came out in May or June or something. But and in the article, I freely admitted, that I had a long and tortuous relationship with substance abuse, starting around the time that my mother was killed. And my father was imprisoned, and I was, ended up, going through about every drug except for the opiates, and became a meth dealer in San Francisco and Oakland, and got arrested and all this stuff. I just wanted to get it all out because I didn't want, and I was told this by a friend. He goes, you need to say anything that somebody thinks they can dig up on you to discredit you. You got to bring it out now. First, and that's what I did, and I wasn't embarrassed by it. I mean, fuck, I didn't know doing drugs wasn't cool. I thought it was cool. That's the age I grew up in.
Right. I mean, what can you do at this point? Your past is your past, and you can't change it. That. Admitting it is a great strategy. I call it the 8 Mile defense, which stems from the film. But let's answer some of those questions about the tape. Now, some have said that your father was either downplaying his role, while others on the opposite side have said that he was inserting himself into what he called the big event. So, do you think the tape is an accurate depiction of his involvement?
I think the tape is extremely accurate. And I'll tell you why. And it's true that my father was probably downplaying up to that point. We hadn't actually gotten into the minutia of what his responsibilities may have been. And we fell under a tremendous amount of pressure from the attorney and from family members to not go through with this. But that being said, and when my father describes himself as a bench warmer in the big event, which was at the time the running code for Kennedy's assassination, I don't think this was a code for other teams who were roving to kill Kennedy, but this particular Florida group, the Cubans, and this is what they refer to it as. I think it's very accurate, and my father, for one thing, if he were to want to fantasize or to construct a narrative, fictionalize anything, he would have fictionalized, or he would have blamed. He would have said something like perhaps the KGB did it. He knows, this is the shocking truth, for me, how the KGB did it, or Castro did it in retaliation for all the attempts that he was involved, my father was involved in to kill Castro, and this and that. My father would have never named his beloved CIA and the people that was in it. But he and I, had agreed that this was going to be absolutely the truth. Even if there was nothing and it was just totally boring. No, I never heard about anything. I didn't know nothing. Just like he'd always said his whole life. But no, that's not what he said. And when you look at how he talks about it, a bench warmer, that's a very particular description of someone involved in something. A bench warmer is part of a team. A bench warmer is someone that is completely knowledgeable of the team's doings and is in a position to oversee the team in action on the field. My father, I believe, was the man on the field in Dallas that would have been able to, at a moment's notice, direct activities to a safe house, to planes waiting to remove certain people from Dallas, vehicles that may have been stashed along the way at certain places, different safe houses that certain people could stay at, someone that had an overall sense of knowledge of what was going to go down and what would be necessary to forestall anything unexpected. And that's really as far as he got. But when you look at the people he names, and there was a brilliant part of Bond of Secrecy written by Eric Hamburg, where he goes, how much of Howard Hunt's scenario holds up under examination, and he comes to the conclusion that surprisingly a great deal. William Harvey was named by my father. Harvey, back in 1959, was one of only 3 officers of the CIA privy to plans to send false defectors to the Soviet Union. Lee Harvey Oswald was one of those false defectors that went under Harvey's program and defected to the Soviet Union. So, Harvey was in direct charge of the anti-Castro operations. When Bobby Kennedy found out that he was still doing these anti-Castro assassination attempts or these runs to the Cuban coast to burn sugarcane fields or what have you, he demoted and dismissed William Harvey and sent him off to be a lackey at the CIA station in Rome, Italy. Well, that didn't stop Harvey, because once he was in Rome, Italy, he started hunting down Corsican-related mafia hitmen from Marseille, the heroin capital there, where all the heroin was processed from Italy, and that's where William Harvey came across persons like Amlash or ZR Rifle, these Corsican assassins, Lucien Sarté and such, and that fits in perfectly. In the book Flawed Patriot by I think Bayard Stockton quotes saying of Harvey, he was placed in the middle of a web of intrigue, and he was central to everything that went on. He was in charge of JMWay, the CIA station in Miami. He knew David Morales. He was instrumental in the ZR Rifle operations, as well as Operation 40. And ZR Rifle was a code name for trained assassins that Harvey recruited from Marseille in France. One of their things they did was they went to the Congo and assassinated Lumumba. Harvey's right there in the thick of things, and he hated the Kennedys. So all the other people that my dad names, they're up to their eyeballs in this whole thing. Cord Meyer was station chief in London, I believe. He was married to a Philadelphia socialite named Mary Meyer, and she and Jack Kennedy had begun a long-standing affair, sexual affair, and also a kinship affair, where Mary was bringing LSD to the president, and they were doing LSD together and smoking marijuana together, and she kept the detailed diary of these type of events and the things that the president had confided in her. And she was murdered in 1964, less than a year after Kennedy was killed. And James Angleton, the head of counterintelligence for the CIA. Within an hour of her death, Angleton and the CIA broke into her studio apartment and retrieved her personal diary, the contents of which have never been released. Cord had his own personal reasons for wanting Kennedy killed because he kind of stole his sweetheart. But also, Kennedy was just a crazed person. He'd been taking these injections from Dr. Max Jacobson, who was known in circles as the original Dr. Feelgood, of methamphetamine injections. And as a matter of fact, he started his injection treatment with John F. Kennedy the night of the first debate between Kennedy and Nixon. JFK was referred to Max Jacobson through a mutual friend, one of the White House photographers. Kennedy, had severe back problems, and he just run out of energy. It was in constant pain, and his photographer friend in the White House said, "Look, I know this guy that will inject you, and you'll feel like brand new." And Jack Kennedy was like, "Bring him here," and that started this intensive relationship with Kennedy and Jacobson, where basically Jacobson was practically living at the White House. He was injecting Jackie Kennedy, he was injecting JFK, he was injecting other members of the inner circle, not RFK, who wanted it to stop, but Jack said, absolutely not. I don't care if he's injecting horse piss in my veins. It works. And Kennedy was completely strung out on his addiction to methamphetamine. As a matter of fact, in a hotel a few months before Kennedy was killed, he had shot himself up because Jacobson provided him with self-injecting amounts of methamphetamine, and Kennedy had injected himself twice, and then he called the doctor, and the doctor injected him with a big shot, and within 45 minutes Kennedy was running down the hallways of this hotel. Of course they were sealed off because the president was there, but stark naked, chasing every girl, secretary, and just practically frothing at the mouth. And the Secret Service was just flipping out because they called Bobby and they called Hoover, and Hoover was aware of all these injections. I mean, really one of the reasons that I think it led to needing JFK out of the way was that he was a complete drug addict. And one of the side effects of methamphetamine, especially injecting it, is this intense need for sex. It literally turns certain people into that's all they can think about. And we all know JFK fucked everything, on two legs, and that's why, because he was stoked up on meth. I mean, I don't know, a lot of people know that, but it's crazy. So that's just another thing about JFK that people just, they thought, this guy's a drug addict. He stays awake for 5, 6, 7 days, and then then he's like a babbling idiot. How can we have the security of the free world and under this guy's control? Come on, It's weird, but that was, I think, one of the determining factors.
Now, your father, E. Howard Hunt, used the term bench warmer to describe his role in the JFK assassination, or at least in Dallas. What I'm wondering is, do you think he would have used the same term to describe his role in Watergate?
That's a really interesting question. One I've never heard, and I've never even thought about that, but I think you've got something there.
Well, and I ask that because the way you describe the term bench warmer is a person who's sort of watching the action rather than participating in the action, sort of guiding the entire strategy rather than taking part in the entire strategy. And I'm wondering if that's the case, and we all know how actively involved he was in Watergate, maybe he wasn't sort of on the back bench. Maybe sort of a bench warmer means that he was actually active.
Yeah. Right. That's exactly what he did in Watergate. So yeah, I mean, that's true. That's true. It isn't. You just made me realize that. Was he involved in Watergate? Of course he was. Was he involved in JFK assassination? By his own admission, a bench warmer? If that's what he was in Watergate, and if that's what he was in the JFK assassination, then most assuredly.
So are you still in the rock and roll world?
No, not really. When I left California, but shortly before I left Northern California 4 years ago, I was leading four different rock groups. I had my own group, St. John and the Sinners, and I had Fleetwood Mac tribute band. I had a Cream tribute band, and had a bossa nova jazz band. And we were booked. We played 3-4 times a week all year long. I mean, for a couple of years. But when I came to Florida, just never hooked up with anybody. So I haven't really played.
So if I asked you who your 3 favorite musical artists were, who would you say?
Beatles, Cream, and Antonio Carlos Jobim.
Wow, that is diverse, my friend. I was not expecting the third answer. So if there's anybody out there who would like to learn more about you, like to see what you're doing, or where they can find information about your books, how would they go about doing so online?
I have a website. I don't know. I haven't been on it in a while. I don't know how active or even what's available, but it's stjohnhunt.net. And that's spelled out SAINTJOHNHUNT.net.
That's stjohnhunt.net. We'll have a link to it on MidnightRiderNews.com. So St. John Hunt, I want to thank you so much for being on the show. Man, I really enjoyed the conversation, and I learned quite a bit. Now, it was a real pleasure to have met you in Dallas, and I definitely hope we can do this again in the new year.
Hey, man, it's a pleasure. It's, like I said last time, it's one of the most relaxed and sort of pleasing interviews that I've ever done. Same as the last time we spoke and interviewed. It's not even like an interview. It's a conversation, and you let me kind of rattle on about things, and get personal about it, because this is a personal story. And if people are interested, they can look up Bond of Secrecy, which was my first book, and then Dorothy, which is like a companion to Bond of Secrecy, really. Tells the story of my mother and her involvement in things. And then I have a book I wrote with Roger Stone called The Bush Crime Family. We're working on another book. I'm writing a book on JFK Jr. and his life and death.
And that will be interesting. Hey, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you, and thanks again for letting me have this chance to discuss these issues. Thanks, SD.
And once again, that was St. John Hunt, the author of Bond of Secrecy, My Life with CIA Spy and Watergate Conspirator E. Howard Hunt, and Dorothy, an amoral and dangerous woman, the murder of E. Howard Hunt's wife, Watergate's darkest secret. Now, he's also co-written the book with Roger Stone about the Bush crime family, and he's working on an upcoming book on JFK Jr. He can be found at stjohnhunt.net. I'm S.T. Patrick. This is the Midnight Rider News Show. We'll be right back. How much did Richard Nixon know about the Watergate break-in? Was the Pulitzer Prize-winning Washington Post really heroic in its uncovering of the Watergate affair? What roles were really played by Alexander Haig and John Dean? And what's this about a call girl ring linked to it all? If you want to hear the story of how Richard Nixon was brought down by a silent coup, listen to episode 003 of the Midnight Rider News Show and allow Lynn Kalani to tell you how Watergate really happened.
This is Lynn Kalani. You're listening to Midnight Rider News Show with S.T. Patrick.
We learned a few things on the show tonight. First, the anti-conspiracy movement, i.e. those who buy the word of the state and the media as gold, often use the line, well, if someone would have known, they would have talked. No one can keep a secret anymore. Okay, well, E. Howard Hunt talked. He talked to his son about Watergate for decades, and then on tape he discussed the JFK assassination with the world. E. Howard Hunt is one of hundreds, but for the sake of argument, let's just focus on Hunt. You heard what he said. He named names. Really, though, it doesn't matter if someone talks, at least not to the mainstream media and the historical establishment. If the person talking agrees with their narrative, then they have validation. If the source revealing the information challenges what they already believe, then they're either lying, untrustworthy, financially motivated, or just wrong. All, by the way, charges that have been leveled against both E. Howard Hunt and St. John Hunt. There is and will be no amount of testimony or evidence that causes the media and the historical establishment to move off their desired line. None. Therefore, the someone would have talked argument is not only factually false, but it's also insignificant to those who control the story. They don't and won't care that someone or many have talked. Second, we learn that everyone's life is unique. How many American kids have two parents who were spies and one who was involved in the most controversial events of the 20th century? What was it like growing up, Hunt? I don't know. And you don't know either. Why did St. John Hunt release the tape? His father asked him to do so. Has he followed up by writing books? Yes. So now telling your story in book form is a crime laden with evil intent in America? When did that happen? It's also always been curious to me that people seem to want the St. John Hunts of the world to do everything altruistically while never profiting. Meanwhile, those making those moral judgments go to work every day claiming they value ingenuity and entrepreneurship. Third, we learn the value of links as amateur and professional historians. Fans of history value links. We try to make them all the time. Some fit, some do not. The characters that overlap the Bay of Pigs, the Kennedy assassination, and the Watergate scandal are astounding. If you're new to critical history, and I know that many of you are, the first thing I can tell you is that you should be looking and listening for links. They may not always be people, they could be organizations, locations, or ideas, but find links. They will tell you much of the story. I recently had someone ask me about the show. I love the show, she said, but why do so much JFK? Well, I can answer that. One, it's a personal fascination as well as an entry point for many truth seekers out there. But second, as we heard tonight, no matter what conspiracy or alternative event or covert operation you're discussing from the 20th century, somehow, in some way, some part of that story runs through Chicago, Tampa, New Orleans, or Dallas in 1963. It's home base for the last century. So, we'll continue to touch home on occasion, and we will continue JFK month every November, because we believe that in this world, you can and should go home again. From the other side of the mountain, on the best side of midnight, I wish you peace.
The Midnight Rider News Show with St. Patrick is a production of MidnightRiderNews.com. Copyright belongs to St. Patrick and all rights reserved. You can email us at midnightridernews@gmail.com. And be sure to visit MidnightRiderNews.com for the best in alternative historical analysis. This is Leanne saying thank you for listening, have a great night, and always remember, when life throws you lemons, throw them back and demand chocolate.